This is an introductory video series on what's an SIEM. Stands for Security Incident and Event Management. And why do we need such a technology? If we start by addressing the internet security, or rather internet insecurity, just imagine how would have been the COVID pandemic. We're still fighting that one without having the internet. Would have been terrible. Well, years ago, the organizations and the governments begin to realize how much we are depending more and more on this internet security or lack of it. Now, let's actually talk about the origins of this. Well, the internet relies on a protocol called TCP/IP. This protocol was created with the intention to have universities to freely share information among them and have a easy connectivity, and security was not at all a concern when this was created. On the other hand, most computers in the internet runs on the Windows. Well, not that is actually changing with Android and iOS and all things, but at least in corporations and sometimes at homes, they run on Windows systems. And I put here DOS because this is just an evolution of what this operating system was. And again, when that was created, conceived, security was not a concern. This was your desktop machine, your portable computer, your desktop computer, and you just turn it on, put a floppy in, you were in. You didn't have to log in to authenticate. None of those things existed. And then as we begin to realize how much we depend on it and how much the bad guys can do against that, and stealing information and ransomware and all the things that we have seen over the years, malware, etc. What we have tried to do is to bolt in security on top of both the internet protocol as well as the operating system. And that has turned out to be very difficult to do. It's like when you build a house without the right foundation, and then thinking of the foundation as an afterthought can become very, very challenging. And that's the origin of why this stuff is so insecure in the first place. In order to fix this, what people realize is that most programs, and they become big enough, they call them applications, they were writing into some files some logs. Security wasn't the main thing about that. It was main sometimes for doing debugging, sometimes for monitoring things on the application, sometimes to write reports to figure things that actually happen. Okay, that's from the program standpoint. From the network side, the routers that move all that TCP/IP packets around from source to destination, they actually, Cisco invented this concept. When they were creating the routers, they created something called flows, or more properly known, net flows. And the information that it was in there, again, wasn't security the main concern at all, but it was things like, what is the source IP of this packet, the destination IP, the source port, and that was important because different applications use different ports, the destination port, amount of data being transferred both on the receiving end as well as the sending, right? So all that information and much more was actually being produced by those routers. Now, when people were decided to begin to do something about it, that gives the prepare the works for the creation of the SIEMs, there were a bunch of compliance mandates, and the governments realized that the industry wasn't going to be doing anything on their own. This needs to be forced on them. They all maximize profits. They think short term. So security is something that is not going to give any profit to what they were doing. It will slow them down. Let's forget about it. But then the compliance regulations in the early days was SOX, PCI, HIPAA. There were many others, and now more famously the GDPR in Europe. Those were very strict, particularly in the GDPR. They were very strict mandates. They say you need to comply with this. You need to make sure that you check all those things. And that's what mostly gave birth to the SIM market. So those logs that were put in a file and those flows that were produced by the routers were actually being sent to these new applications, and we are talking about maybe 15 years ago or so, called security incident and event management. And the intention of the SIEM was to correlate, and more on this later, but to correlate logs and flows and different logs and different flows in order to detect things that were suspicious, that were bad, that were out of place, and from that generate, some systems call it alerts, others call it cases. In QRadar, we call those offenses. These are things that require your attention, things that we strongly invite you to investigate and look upon. But they were, by just sending those logs and flows into this technology, the creation of the SIM was running into some particular problems. Well, first, these logs were written by the programmer, again, not thinking of security necessarily, but mostly those were human readable. They were very lengthy in text and basically were meant for a human to understand what is happening. And that created the need of some what is called a parser. A parser is something that will mimic a human taking the information coming on a log and understand its different parts. In QRadar, we call those parsers DSM, Device Support Module. Now, the challenge of those human readable logs is that it's not easy in computer technology to really understand. I mean, we didn't have technologies like AI and Watson and those things, so that can understand spoken or written language. So those programs rely at that time on something called regular expressions. And these are things that are not intuitive at all. They're very powerful. They're capable of extracting parts, and more on that I'll show you a log in a second, and extract the right components from it. Now, I just want to be positive on this. Things are not bad because modern logs for new applications are really machine readable from the very beginning. So you don't need to do those pesky regular expressions. And they come in different formats of XML, like JSON. They can be XML, they can be Leaf, they can be another format is Ceph. I mean, there are many others. But the idea of this is that these are clearly produce and separate it into parts that makes the understanding of a program of what's in there very easy. So no need for regular expressions. So logs are sent to the Siem, flows are sent to the Siem, and they are actually parsed. Let's stop here and show you an example. I'm going to be using QRadar for all these examples. Let's actually take a look at one particular log. So I'm here in my QRadar system, and we can actually see here the logs actually coming into my machine, and we can actually see the flows, the net flows actually coming here and there. But let me show you one log in particular. And I'm using very simple examples here because this is a very introductory video, but we can see here the nature of those logs, right? This is the timestamp. They begin with that, entry and contains information. Like, for example, there's a username here. There's some size of some transfer being sent. There's a timestamp, other things in here. The important thing is not to understand these particular logs, but they are all logs like that, and many more are much more extensive in the amount of information. But the role of the parser is nothing more than extract from it this type of information. What is the event description, what's the username, and if there are other fields, they might not be present on that specific log like we see here, but the ones that are, the idea of the parser is to grab them from the actual log in here. Sometimes this is called the payload, although that term can be confusing when we talk about flows. But to extract them from here and put it into what is called categories. For example, the category here is content information, to give it an event name, to give extract the fields, the custom properties like a username and other things that can be used to put some logic that will be in a rule, more on that later, that allows for you to monitor and to detect those bad things. And there is a component in QRadar to actually manage the parsing of those. Normally you don't have to deal with that. Actually, I select the wrong one. And the tool is called Dsm Editor, in which if you need to, you can actually modify it or extract. Let's say that there are some, we can see the properties are extracted in here. Okay, but let's say that you want to extract a particular thing that the original creators of the parser is not doing, like for example this size parameter. You can easily actually do that, and then do the mapping for the right categories and the rest of the stuff. Again, this is an introductory video, no need to get into more details about this. Same thing that is done with the logs is actually done with the flows. The flows are sent to QRadar with actually the right components are extracted and put into the right properties that will be used later for the rules to detect things that are out of place. Now, let's actually stop this video here. This is the part one. In the next video, we're going to see how can we use this information once it is parsed. How can we use it with the logic in the rules to actually fire those alerts, those offenses, those cases that invite you to investigate what actually happened in there.